Yes, hi, good afternoon. Hope you can hear me. My mic's on, by magic. Really good tech in this place. Yes, so I guess coming third is a good thing in that now you've had a really great LCA case study to get your head into LCA. And this, what I'm talking about particularly is the data that we need to do LCA studies. And particularly, let me go to my, first slide. So I sort of broke this into three distinct topics. The middle one was really, number 2, is this roadmap for developing a national LCA database. So in order to do LCAs, we need the data. So that's the main topic of my talk. And then in order to do that, I thought I better first maybe back up and make sure everybody knew what lifecycle inventory was, and pretty much to make the case of why do we need a national LCI database, which, as I said, does make it slightly easier coming third, because I think now we've seen an application of lifecycle assessment and perhaps why we do need it. And then the third component of my talk is around some data sets that we already have and how we could use these to start the ball rolling on a national LCA database. So as I said, backing up first, I'm not sure of the knowledge of this audience. The topics lifecycle management and circular economy, all related topics. And you'll see that even in my initial slide there, I kept on mixing LCI and LCA, and it can all be a bit confusing, LCM, lifecycle management, as to what all these acronyms and things actually are. So this is the picture that you often see for lifecycle assessment. I liked William's linear one, because in truth, we really do deal with linear value chains at this stage. But the aspirational picture of LCA is always to have this circular system, which sort of fits in quite well with circular economy, which is why LCA and circular economy are fairly compatible bedfellows. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. Back a bit. Yeah. The sort of circular economy, but lifecycle assessment would really be around providing the quantitative, so circular economy is maybe the aspiration. Lifecycle assessment is all around providing the actual numbers and the data and the metrics for circular economy. This picture, very much similar to the linear value chain, but the idea is in a lifecycle assessment, you want to take the full product value chain into account. So you start with your, that's why I'm going wrong, there we go. You start with raw materials, which as with the plastics often are where the big impact lies, but you need to follow your life cycle all the way through, because quite often it's actually counterintuitively perhaps in the use phase, which I thought was a really fascinating thing for the carpets. Who would have thought that it's vacuuming your carpet where a lot of your impact lies? So similarly with things like cars, which we well know, the use phase is often your biggest impact area. So the whole idea of LCA is really having this whole product value chain from what we call cradle to grave. Ideally, we want a circular system with no particular grave, but in reality, we have material going out to disposal, and hopefully we have a lot of reuse going on in our circle. So as I said, lifecycle assessment is really around the quantitative part of it. So lifecycle, maybe just to explain the acronyms, lifecycle management is the umbrella tool, whereas lifecycle assessment is the quantitative sub-tool of lifecycle management. And it's really a model of all the product, all the materials and energy that goes into a product or service. It's primarily product. We talk about product LCA, but it could equally be providing a service. Let's say, so with the carpeting, your product is carpeting, but you could also reframe that as some companies do these days and sell you a flooring service, in which case they'll come back and take it away, remanufacture it, and bring it back. Because what you want is the nice floor in your apartment, not necessarily the actual carpet. So it's broad enough to try and encompass products and services. So it goes around quantifying all those material and energy flows, all the inputs, all the outputs across that whole value chain. And then it takes it one step further, which is to actually model the consequence of those flows on our health, the health of ecosystems, on human health, the health of ecosystems, and also on the availability of resources. So it's really what are we concerned about, and we want to model those impacts. A key feature is this cradle-to-grave nature, again, coming nicely after William really talked about the whole idea of both environmental and socioeconomic impacts to be taken into account. So it's really very ambitious, but you need to do that because you want to improve entire systems and not just single parts of systems. So the whole idea of a life cycle assessment is you don't just fix something that's perhaps happening on your factory, where it actually, by changing raw materials, that you may be creating a bigger impact somewhere else within your product value chain. So you want to avoid decisions that sort of fix one problem but just cause another unexpected environmental problem. So you can see it's used particularly both in policy support. So if you're a government and you wanted to devise policy, you want to be making sure that whatever policy you're putting into place is actually making a difference and improving things and not just merely making it worse somewhere else. Or it can be used within industry. Eco-design is a popular application. So if you want to design a new product, you want to change your materials, or as a product designer, you often, if you don't, more and more there's the idea that you actually need to take your use phase into account, because often that's the longest time period where the biggest impacts, they may be small, but then they're cumulative over a 20-year lifespan of a product. So when you're a designer, if you're already thinking of your product use phase, you actually can minimize the full environmental impacts of your product or system. So that's life cycle assessment, but as you can imagine, it requires lots of data. So it's really a data-driven model. This is just an example to rather put a picture rather than just talk of things in the abstract. This is a relatively simple life cycle model of a beef steak that lands on your plate at a braai. But it's going to go through all these value chain steps, starting with your farm and then going right down to sort of slaughtering and processing, so some sort of plant and distribution, retail, until it lands up at your plate. So that's what I'm saying sort of a life cycle system would be. When you're doing a study, you may well be, say, I don't know, the people actually making the steak. So perhaps you're sitting there as a meat processor. You may or may not know your suppliers, but generally in a life cycle study, you concentrate on what we call the foreground. You would go talk to perhaps the people where you're getting your cattle from, where they're sourcing their cattle from, and you can go and do material and energy balances, find out their electricity that they use. It's a lot of data collection, but it's sort of durable, and that's what a life cycle study is. A lot of sort of grunt work of going to talk and getting to know your suppliers. It's actually one of its key outcomes is a really integrated supply chain. So you kind of actually learn a lot just by going to talk to your suppliers. Where the difficult part comes in is all these things on the left-hand side here, because if you're the wanting to do the study here, you also don't want to go out and do life cycle assessments on electricity and on water supply and on all the fuels, the diesel used in the trucks in distribution, the LPG used in your machinery, in your lifters, in your distribution center. You don't want to go and do LCAs on all chemicals coming in, so fertilizers and pesticides. You probably don't also want to go and do a whole LCA on plastic packaging or whatever other packaging you're doing for your steak. So there's a huge amount, and there's also on the end of your life. So we want to, in a full LCA, you need to include the end of life. So you also don't want to go and do whole studies on waste disposal, landfilling. So there's a huge amount of data that sits and underpins an LCA study, which we call the background data. And generally, this is the data you draw from an LCA database. So if you want to do an LCA study, you do not want to go around then and doing visiting each one of Eskom's power stations and perhaps the new PV solar plants and all of that. So it's ridiculous. It would make it unworkable. So what happened in the rest of the world is lifecycle databases, which is all great for people that, if you're not South African, but our electricity, our fuel is pretty unique, and pulling it straight from a European database does not necessarily or at all give you very good or robust life cycle results for South Africa. So this idea of LCA database, and they really grew up with the field of LCA in terms of actually just making it a workable assessment tool. This is a bit of a technical slide, but just to get some of these ideas of lifecycle inventory from Lifecycle Database. So a Lifecycle Database stores what we call lifecycle inventory. So let me just go back to this one. When you make an LCA, you have all these individual blocks that I spoke about. So each one of these we would call a unit process, and each one has material flows and energy going out and waste products and emissions. Those all individually are what we call life cycle inventory. So each one is a data set, and when you add them all up together, then they become a life cycle assessment. So that's the difference between the sort of the LCI and the LCA. So when we talk of an LCA database, it's to do LCAs, but what you need is a collection of LCIs, these building blocks, which we can then combine up to make our LCA. So just drawing that distinction, a database is a set of LCI datasets. And really important is this idea that if you have a database, if you want to do a good LCA model, you have to have consistent LCIs. You can't sort of grab LCIs from various places. You need them that they need to conform to a common set of methodological criteria. So if anyone's tried to do LCA, there's quite a lot of choices that inevitably get done, system boundaries, and I didn't want to make this too technical a talk, but you can get really crazy results, wrong results, if you just grab data from all over the place. And the idea of a database is that it's giving you reviewed, consistent data sets that can reliably be combined up together to make a good, sound result for an LCA result. In a database, the other thing to bear in mind is the second half of LCA, which is where you then take it on, and there were some good slides, thank you. William, for all those LCIA slides, those are all impact categories. That's what comes next. You put that onto your lifecycle inventory data, and you get your LCA results. So when you have an LCA database, you want your flow names and everything to map properly onto impact assessment names. So you've got to have those other models that people develop, but your data has to talk to that to make sense. So it gets a bit technical, but it is really important. So that's what a nice, consistent, useful LCA database that would make doing an LCA study relatively quick, or as quick and easy as an LCA study is ever going to be. Just in contrast, Dataset Library there are a couple of these around, and this is often where you start, maybe as a country, is sort of ad hoc collections of life cycle data sets. So already in South Africa, we've actually been a LCA research community for a good 20 years or so. So there are all sorts of masters, theses and PhDs that have been done, but no one's ever made, within a university, or maybe somebody has a set of them, that would be a library, a dataset library, like a library of theses or something, but they haven't ever been put into any coherent or cohesive form. And then a data hub is sort of a similar idea, where it's taking a way of getting access to different sources of life cycle data, and I'm going to talk a bit about one particularly that was involved in the project that I'm mainly talking about. That's called GLAD, but that's slightly different in that it's allowing you to access life cycle data. And there are a couple of those. There's the US Digital Commons, I think it's called, and there's one called Open LCA Nexus, which collates a whole bunch of LCA data, but it's not consistent or reviewed or like a database would be. So just to make that distinction. So those individual little building blocks that I showed in the system diagram there was really just to show, so each one of those is where your material and energy balance helps. So you have a reference product, and that's, you'll have byproducts and all the emissions coming out of those individual data sets, the life cycle inventories. And they get rolled up, which is that big boundary I drew around the outside, and there, once you've aggregated your results up into what's called the final lifecycle inventory. Then you do the impact assessment and you get your LCA results. Okay, so why do we want one of these? Why a national LCA database? I think, we've heard a lot this circular economy and sustainable consumption and production, but really these are good, it's difficult actually to move these from concepts into supporting actual decisions or moving towards sustainable consumption and production or towards circular economy without actually putting some numbers behind it. So it's really a cornerstone of sustainable consumption and production. And if you want to report on progress, you need some sort of data to underpin it. So I've just put the two of the SDGs there, but South Africa's committed to reporting on the SDGs, UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and that requires data to underpin that. The same thing with evidence-based policy making. It sounds great, but you actually need the data to support the evidence. And currently, LCA policymakers in South Africa are hampered by the lack of reliable, just LCA data, but sort of environmental data that covers South Africa's specific contexts and needs. So there are a lot of international data, but when you start looking into it, South Africa has a number of very unique and different, so something that looks one way, an LCA study isn't actually something that is directly transferable, and I can give you lots of examples where a South African study comes up really quite differently to what a European study or what an American study came up with, largely because of our very carbon-intensive electricity, because of the way we have landfill, we don't have incineration, we don't have energy recovery at end of life. So those things make a really big difference. So partly, we need a database if we're going to do evidence-based policymaking for our policymakers, but it's also not only that, it's also for industry to drive sustainable production. And an LCA database helps grow capacity, not only in developing the data, which it's certainly in the project I'll quickly outline now, it certainly did, because when you're doing it, you're learning and you're building capacity, but it also, once there is the data available, then it's more easy for somebody to do an LCA study and build capacity that way as well. So onto the roadmap for developing a national LCA database. I'm running rather slow, I'll try and speed up. This was a project commissioned by the UN Environment, all these logos at the bottom, but it's the Lifecycle Initiative, which is a unit that sits within UN Environment in Paris, which are sort of tasked with growing LCA globally. And the project was funded by the European Commission. Actually, I've got this out here. So under the REAL project, called the Resource Efficiency through Application of Life Cycle Thinking. So it's European Commission funded, but through UN Environment as the project commissioner, with the objective to develop national LCA databases in a number of different countries. So the scope was to establish roadmaps towards developing national LCA databases. It started with doing a baseline assessment, stakeholder mapping and engagement, then a formation of a national database working group, and then roadmap development. And then the final activity are these data-related activities, and that's when I come to that I mentioned earlier, this Global LCA Data Access Network. Oh, don't know why we went to sleep there. I'm taking too long on the slides. That's the last part, so I'll get to that. Just to give you an idea, it was a big international project consortium. It was led by EcoInvent Association out in Switzerland, and they have been the developers of probably the largest national database, which was Switzerland, and have been a global leader in LCA data. So they won the tender when it went out with putting together a consortium of which we at the University of Cape Town were, sorry, I keep on using the wrong thing. We at the University of Cape Town were one of the we're the South African partner, but there's a number of other countries, which was Brazil and Ecuador and India and Sri Lanka and Uganda. So we had every 2 weeks Skype meetings where we shared experiences, which was interesting because Brazil already has a national database, but it's sort of stalled in its development, whereas somebody like Uganda and Ecuador were really starting out on the early days of just in LCA capacity in general in their countries, whereas we in South Africa are quite similar to India and Sri Lanka in a way, in that we've had research in LCA for some years, but we've never really managed to get it further than that out of the universities and into policy and into industry and that. So we shared experiences while we did our roadmaps and reviewed each other's roadmaps, actually. So UCT was the project team there. That's myself and Professor Harry from Blotnitz were there, but we worked with various not necessarily life cycle experts, but let's say circular economy. We heard from Dr. Henry Roman this morning. Peter Lukey is also looking at evidence-based, the affiliations are also old. I thought I'd write them as they were when we did the project, not as they are now. So the DST and the DIA should indeed change. I think the rest have all stayed the same. So we also had Lee from NCPC. We had the Innovation Hub and some academic, and then Green Cape. So we tried to get together a diverse, and WWF representing civil society. So we wanted a diverse stakeholder group, but fairly small so that it could be quite focused on actually coming out with the roadmap. Missing there is industry. So when we did our stakeholder mapping, we didn't get an industry partner that was willing to join the stakeholder or the database working group. Being fairly early stages, I guess, in LCA, it's difficult to see the value, but that certainly is a gap. This is rather long. So these slides are all very long, and I am closing out to the end of my time. So I'm going to really whiz through them, but mainly there is a link, and I would really hope you would go and look at the roadmap for the detail on these slides. So rather, we like the style of the UN, UNEA documents. They always start with this preamble. So we did the same, which is sort of noting why we need the database in South Africa. I think notably, stuff I've mentioned earlier, but really that there's a strong alignment of the SDGs with South Africa's National Development Plan, with the NDP, and that we need data to underpin the evidence-based policymaking to transition toward the SDGs and complementary to the NDP. This was the vision. So a South African National Lifecycle Database is a repository of credible datasets useful in evidence-based policy and decision-making advancing sustainable development. So as in any roadmap, it's underpinned by the vision, and that's our vision, which was hammered out with our database working group and then put out to wider comment. And then after the vision, we needed to create the goals. So these are the three goals for a South African National Lifecycle Database to achieve that vision. I'll read these out. So first of all, it had to be open access and transparent data for the public good, fit for use with scientifically based lifecycle impact assessment methods. So lots of debate, but there are countries where it's not open access necessarily. So EcoInvent is one. The Swiss one, it is actually fairly expensive to buy it. You can get it for free. No, not actually only as a non-OECD country, you can get it free for academic use, but even academia, you pay a fair amount to access the Swiss national database. But we felt that for value in South Africa, it really needed to be open access and for the public good. Our second goal was it needs to have environmental and social dimensions represented objectively for major products and services in the South African economy. And that is also fairly, I guess, ambitious, but also novel in that life cycle assessment does tend to stick on the environmental side. But we were saying that for South Africa, not having a social dimension really doesn't there's less justification for such a data project if we didn't include the social dimension, being critical for both the SDGs and especially for the NDP, where poverty eradication and social equity is one of the key drivers for growth and development. And the third goal is that it must be updated periodically as the nation's sustainability transition unfolds to assist with quantifying progress. So a challenge with lifecycle databases is they can't be a static snapshot in time. It really needs to be updated continually, at least every 3 to 5 years. So that's there as one of the goals. Following on from the goals, then we have objectives. And as I said, I'm not going to go through these slides totally, but I just wanted to highlight sort of in the document the things that we really lay out in a bit more detail, which is governance and management, funds and financing, and then the human resourcing needs of a national database. So we have further detail on that. Matching, so each of the goals match to objectives. So those are the 3 goals, and then we matched specific objectives to each of those, under those. And that was where I'd say for the roadmap project, we spent most of the time and effort in our workshops. So we had 3 workshops with the database working group to hammer this out before we came up with the document. And it really, at an early stage, it's the governance and the management that really needed possibly the most discussion. The next aspects that are considered in the roadmap are the more technical aspects, and these are sort of the database hosting and access, data needs and availability, data quality and review, and then data format and database interoperability. So those are the technical aspects, and we kind of felt that, well, whatever we do in South Africa, we would follow international best practice. So a lot of sort of the data format, which are big contentious issues maybe in a technical field side of things, we would, as South Africa, as long as whatever we did was compatible with global best practice. So we thought, it's more important to focus on the first aspects rather than on these more technical aspects. But they are there in the document as well, and there are objectives under each of those goals for those as well. The heart of a roadmap is implementation. So after we'd done the goals and objectives, discussed the sort of founding ideas, we need an implementation plan. And it's critically where, of course, we sit with establish your founding partners. And that's where we are at the moment, and very much hope this process doesn't stall at the end of sort of the EU funding and a nice document out there that lays out a possible path. But it's really needing to find somebody to champion the roadmap and take it forward, and to be the founding partners. So certainly from our database working group members, we're in discussion and really hope that there is somebody that will take it further. Of course, alongside taking it further is this really critical, secure funding. And this is the same for all of our countries, actually. It was all, yes, great, lots of interest, but who's going to fund this? So does the European Commission want to fund the follow-on project? So they really funded this first step, but it's really without finding champions and funding partners. But I think the project's been useful because it's laid out some concrete steps that certainly haven't been there before. We've had a couple of meetings also funded by the UN and the Lifecycle Initiative. So I think there were a series of 2 to 3 meetings about a national database, but they don't ever really get further than the discussion. Now we have a document that lays it out further, but really hope that it will catalyze that critical further action. So we had short-term activities, which are, of course, the most critical, because if they don't happen, then nothing else happens. Then we had medium-term activities, which were really around, so once you've got it going, once you've got a champion and a starting group, you set up your structures for the database and appoint a manager, a steering committee, an expert committee. So those are all, you can read about those in the document, but that's sort of the governance structure that we suggested. And then we have the longer term, which would be to actually get to the point where we're actually doing data projects. which would be great. So that's in the longer term, but really it all comes down to the short-term activities. Sorry, Lee, I'm going very over. Can I have 2 more minutes? Because this project was done through the UN Lifecycle Initiative, they have another initiative which is called the Global LCA, I always get it wrong, GLAD, let's call it the GLAD network. So it's where they're trying to set up this really, it sounded super ambitious when they first started it, but what they want to do is have a database, a global system website where you can go and find all the LCA data, everyone contributes, and you can instantly find the data you need going to your right country. And for this, it's actually a very technical thing called interoperability, where data sets need to talk to each other because we're a global world, but we don't like to follow the same rules. So some people do data in this way, some people do another format, and database interoperability is all about, on a technical side, getting those to talk to each other. So because they also fund that, they wanted to put this project in a little bit with that project. So one of our commitments was to put some data sets out there on GLAD, which ties in with another project we did with EcoInvent, which was called the ESRI project, which is a strange name called Sustainable Recycling Industries, even though the part that we were involved in had nothing to do with recycling per se, but it had to do with creating data sets for South Africa. I've actually got a next slide on that, so I won't go into that too much. But what we did under that ESRI project was develop some data sets for some key sectors of the South African economy. And that involved a number of South African universities and organizations, and was quite a big component of that project was training. So NCPC was the co-host of that, co-manager of that, and they coordinated a number of training workshops, as well as those, some of the consultancies and universities that hadn't done life cycle assessment before were creating those data sets. So it was good for capacity building, but it also came up with a number of really useful data sets that are all coming up in EcoInvent, because this was an EcoInvent, although it was actually funded by the Swiss, it's called SECO, the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. They were the funder of the project. It was done through the Swiss national database called EcoInvent, with the rationale which is shown on this slide, really. So as the Swiss database, which was Swiss, has really become quite a global database. It's the most widely used database within sort of the LCA globally. But they sit with this thing, and that's what this picture is showing, is that, you know, all their data is up there in Europe, the dots corresponding to the number of data sets they have. I think they've got around 14,000 data sets, but they were really concentrated in Western Europe, which you would understand, being a Swiss database. But increasingly, there's the acknowledgement that, well, actually, the demand may be sitting in Europe, but the supply actually is coming less and less. You know, certainly on the resource side, you know, what's actually made in Switzerland is exceedingly small. So this ESRI project, funded by SECO, was to build LCA expertise in developing in newly industrialized countries and create critical core LCI data, which then, being an EcoInvent project, actually is going into the EcoInvent database, which will be available in upcoming release of that. Not yet. Some of it's already in, actually, but not all of it. So these are the sectors that were covered. Nice, colorful pictures falling off. But the sectors were sort of chosen to be particularly useful for South African life cycle studies, so which is why we're optimistically saying they form the nice seeds for a database, because they cover electricity and coal, which really come into just about any product life cycle you can think of. It will draw electricity. Also really useful for just about all life cycles is fuel and transport, because there will inevitably be some sort of road freight transport, and either you're using fuel directly in your process or in your transport. A big component was cement and concrete that was done at the University of Johannesburg. They developed a whole bunch of building material data sets. Then there were some data sets on mining. Those were included because it's unique things in South Africa, particularly relevant for export. Agriculture, there are some data sets on agriculture. Those were the ones done within South Africa. And then there were some other three projects that weren't actually done by South African institutes, so there was no capacity building or learning on that side, but they did develop data sets on South Africa. So there's a whole bunch of water supply data sets. And the waste disposal equally wasn't done specifically for South Africa, but what we did get in there, which has never been in before, it's always been Swiss databases, Swiss landfill, which is a beautifully managed landfill with leachate capture that then gets incinerated, which is not at all, of course, what happens on a South African landfill. So what was done under this project was things to actually better enable us to model South African products, which was open burning and unsanitary landfill and open dumping. So it was, even those aren't specific for South Africa, they're for different conditions and include the sort of the unmanaged dumping of waste, which we've never had before. So those are the data sets. I've just put these up just to get the feel of the extent of them, because even though when we bid for these projects, they all turned out to be very much longer than we expected, because when you're doing product, they've each got these sub-products that ended up being done. So quite certainly for the building materials, all different MPa strengths of concrete. So it wasn't just one data set, it turned into a number of data sets. So for the transport, there's all the different lorry sizes and different fuel standards. And that's the water ones. So although the sectors are such, the actual data sets are quite a large number, actually up to 80 of them, which is exciting to have those for South Africa, but frustrating for those that don't have the EcoInvent database. As I said, it is priced in euros, so pretty pricey for most users. So with this project, we're going to make a selection of those data sets available on this global LCA database network free of charge, which is quite exciting, and that's from EcoInvent being involved in both projects. Just a little bit more about this GLAD platform. So there's its website address. You can go there and look. It's only in beta form at the moment, which is, I think, why the Lifecycle Initiative wanted to use this project to try and push more data sets into GLAD. But the idea is to have this network of independently operated LCA databases, and GLAD provides an interface for you to go and find the data that you need. And as I said, it's a UN Environment project. Well, they're actually just the secretariat, and they actually get funding contributions, as they say, from various governments around the world, and also some contributions from private sector. So it's really a global thing where they are just the secretariat. This is what it looks like. So it's just a web interface, and you can go and search. It's free of charge to get the data sets. What this is, though, it really is it's like a hub. So if you find a data set, so now if you search and there's a data set for South Africa, it will bring up the database and just put you in touch with EcoInvent to go and buy that data. If it's a paid-for data, if it's free, it's available for download. So what we've done at the end part of this project is to interface with how you need to prepare your data to put up there, which has been quite challenging, which means we only have 24 of our data sets that are going up there, but there's quite a lot of work that needs to go behind and this actually getting them ready to put them onto GLAD. And we chose, hopefully, to give a nice selection from the 3 data sets to sort of get the breadth out there. And these will be connected. Was hoping they would have been connected by now, and this talk would have been showing them and demonstrating them, but they are still under technical development on EcoInvent's side. So they're still saying the end of 2019, which is getting less and less. So hopefully they'll be out soon. As I said, there's the link to the roadmap, or here's my email address. If you drop me an email, I would be very happy to share it with you. Happy to receive comments on it. Very happy if you'd want to join in some capacity, be a partner, take it forward. We are planning to have a webinar when the GLAD datasets do eventually go live, so that we could demonstrate how to use them, how to download them, and navigate through them, and we will do that. So if you would like to be informed of that, also please drop me an email. And that's it. Sorry, I did go quite a lot over time, but thank you.